There we go. Mic check. 1 2 1 2. This is a test. This is a test. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. 1 2 1 2.
Hello, how are you? It's okay. I just sent it. I think we're okay. How are you doing? Good to see you. Are you able to open it, Jess, or would a flash drive be better?
Give me a second.
Okay. What is? It's like I've never seen the flash drive. Yes, that makes total sense.
Of course it is.
Yep, that's it.
And
Perfect.
not
We'll
anyone.
give you. I'm gonna bring you.
I'll just leave it over there to the side.
Okay, so don't bring
But
it in the
enable
slideshow
editing.
version.
Nuh-uh. Because it's going to populate those screen and open back up your Google.
Give me a second.
Just click on it and it'll populate to the front. Yeah, just click on it. There you go. Then go back to your StreamYard. Then when you go to share, click on share. Share screen. Yep. And then Windows. Should click on Windows. It should. There you go. And then you just click on. Yep.
Yeah, probably.
Yep. And see it's there. And then if you in the right hand corner, click on it. Let's see this one right here. See if that changes it. We're just not. They're just not the progressive slide, with and that's fine. It's no biggie. We can. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that at all. All right, mic check. Mic check. 1 2 1 2.
It's just like
That's another
they're not
thing.
buttons.
The main thing
You gotta
is
use the remote.
set up.
Yeah. So he's like, have a barrel here to get your back up in case this thing cracks out. You know.
What am I saying?
I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable on this one.
No, you're good.
And I have to dip out because
We even had a virtual family yesterday.
I
Yeah,
do.
too.
How'd it
It
go?
was 6 hot months and no feedback.
Nice.
That's how I already got you logged in.
It's good quality as some dude who's living in another country on the laptop's gonna be, but I mean, it
Right,
wasn't
but
like-
still, no. The live part's the
Yeah.
hard part.
Yeah.
That's great. You're great. You're able to put it on without feedback. And
Yeah. All right. Thanks,
It
Jazz.
usually works if you only
Yep.
have.
Just call me and let me know if something comes up. Okay?
Yeah.
Let me just say this stays
Yeah.
off mute and
If somebody else opens up their Zoom.
this just
Yeah.
stays exactly how it's right?
Yep. Just exactly how it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then for this
Yeah.
one, yes, you gotta make sure. Yeah, make this a wide screen. Andy Kyle, thanks so much. Appreciate your hard work. Oh, my bad. It's okay.
We've been working together for 25 years.
It's like you get married and you start looking like the other person. Like, oh my god.
All right.
All right.
So should we just introduce ourselves again and just get started? I didn't know if you had to make any announcements or
No, I'm
anything
actually
like
about to head out right now. So.
Good to see you too. I haven't seen you in so long. I haven't seen you in there in so long.
I know. Oh man. I feel like it's like, you know, when you're drowning and you get your head above water, you're like, it's just that kind of taking those deep breaths in.
We just did our research presentation, working on our program. Somebody in the audience is like, just looking at your presentation makes me tired. Exactly.
How are we feeling? We ready?
All the things y'all do it, I'm like,
I'm so like.
Are you okay?
No, not really, but I'm fine.
Okay.
we tell people all the time to slow down.
Just like a lot going on.
We so immersed sometimes we feel like we're not doing enough. That's the irony.
going to problem solve
I
and
was doing
do
so
this.
much
You know,
of
so
a lot of stuff.
Well, you handled it well, though.
Data.
thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. We're going to get started on our concurrent session or our breakout session called Street Par and Quantitative Analysis, doing LCA with the streets. My name is Dr. Ann Aviles. This is
Kathleen McAllips.
graduate student here. We're both in HDFS.
I'm Dr. Collier. I'm a professor in the School of Education, and I focus on education research and statistical methods.
Dr. Chen, I'm at Christiana Care Health System as one of the physicians there.
And I'm Dr. Yasser Payne, Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice.
Awesome. So we have two papers that we're going to be presenting this afternoon. Both of them, though, so many of you were a part of, and also hey to the folks online, were a part of the plenary that just happened. And so the data that we're going to be talking about actually comes from the Street Par Health Project, which is the data collection of the 700 plus surveys, right? The qualitative interviews, blood pressure. And so we're going to talk about how we took this data to create these papers. Our paper is currently under review, so fingers crossed that we're going to get it accepted. And I believe you all, right, your paper is in process right now.
Process is a good way to describe
Yes,
it.
yes, you know. We call it in preparation in the academy, right? So, all right. So, oh, can you do it? It's not. That's fine. Go ahead. Go to the next slide, please.
Oh, you don't want to, you can't do a full?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not working. It won't do it as a slideshow because of the stream. That's okay. That's fine. So we just wanted to start by providing a little bit more context. We know we talked about Wilmington. These are actual photos. As I shared in the previous session, my colleagues and I have been doing canvassing in the city of Wilmington. And so for me, it became very stark and very obvious, right, the disinvestment. So when we talk about these issues of structural violence, this is an example of what we're talking about, right? You have communities that the city is not supporting. And I just want to highlight, let's see, will this thing work? That sign right there, it's hard to see, and that sign right there is actually a sign saying that the Wilmington Housing Bank actually owns these properties. So this is not neglect by landlords, this is neglect by the city. And so this is an example of the structural violence that is occurring related to housing in the city of Wilmington. Next slide, please. In terms of housing access, what we wanted to highlight here is the fact that there is not enough affordable housing in the city of Wilmington. It might be hard to see. Right here, though, this number says that we lack over 15,000 homes, affordable homes. So even if you make enough money to afford, right, a rental unit, it's not there. And so I really just wanted to highlight that. Third slide. All right, awesome. Here shows the median income, $45,000, right, is what you need in order to afford a two-bedroom apartment in the city of Wilmington. Many of the folks that we were working with, that we collected data from, definitely are under that income, right? So again, just to highlight the ways in which structurally, not only the housing stock is not available, but when it comes to income, we are not paying folks enough to afford the housing stock that is actually available. Next slide, please. This slide highlights some of what I was just saying. So Newcastle County, there's 3 counties in the state of Delaware: Newcastle, Sussex, and Kent. Newcastle is the largest county in the state of Delaware, and that is where the largest city in Delaware is, which is Wilmington. There are only 32 available and affordable rental homes that exist for every 100 extremely low income households that need them. So again, we want to highlight here that this is structural, that there's only 32 for the 100 people that need them. We also see the second bullet is that these are issues of race, ethnicity, and class. 62% of Latinx renters are cost burdened by their rents. And what that means in the literature is that people are spending more than 30% of their income on their rent. What the research says is that we should not spend more than 30% of our income on rent, because when we do that, we have less money for food and utilities and gas and all the other basic necessities. So we see here it's 62% of Latino renters, 60% of Black renters are cost burdened, and 48% of white renters are also cost burdened. And here, if we're thinking about this from a critical race theory perspective, right, that intersectionality of both race and class, and just to highlight that white folks are experiencing cost burden too, but definitely at lower rates than their Black and brown counterparts. What we also see is that Black Delawareans experience homelessness 4 times the rate of white Delawareans. So there is something called the PIC count, or the point in time count, which a lot of research shows that actually it is undercounts the number of people that are experiencing homelessness. The way it works is people go out into the streets and they count the number of people, but sometimes they do this in like January, February, which by that point people have figured out some kind of housing. So definitely recognizing that these numbers are actually probably undercounting the number of Black folks that are experiencing homelessness in the state of Delaware. And then again, thinking about the population we are focused on, which is street identified folks, oftentimes have experiences with the carceral system. So in Delaware, right, Black folks make up 21% of the state population. However, 60% of the prison population, way overrepresented. And again, an example of structural violence, because we know that Black and brown communities are policed more. For similar crimes, there are more punitive outcomes that often lead to incarceration. Oh, next slide. I'm doing it on my computer, like you all can see it. So in terms of housing and health, and this is some of the work that we'll start to get, that we really focused on for this analysis, is recognizing one is housing quality, right? So is your house safe? Is it free of toxins? Do you have running water? Things like that. Is it affordable, which you all saw from the previous slides? No, it is not. Also the housing community, where is your unit actually located? Oftentimes, again, the population we have been focusing on are people living in disinvested communities. So we know that not only is the house, right, not well taken care of, but the community itself lacks the resources folks need to survive. And then that couples with here, the housing location. Again, do you have access to things like public transportation, parks, recreation, quality schools, employment, things of that nature? Next slide, please. So one of the factors that we really looked at through this data is housing and well-being. So we were very much interested in how housing quality, neighborhood quality have this symbiotic relationship to a person's well-being. Just think about, many of you may be traveling, right? Or for my folks online, even when we choose to go stay somewhere in a hotel or whatever it might be, after a little while, you're like, I just want my own bed, I want my own shower, all of those things. So imagine what it means for someone who is coming home from prison who does not have that safety and stability in housing, right? The toll that it takes on a person's overall well-being and health. And so that is what we were really interested, is looking at this relationship between your housing status and your well-being. Next slide, please. What we find is when it comes to, and I will say there's not a lot of literature. When we were doing the literature review for this paper, there isn't a lot of literature specifically on housing and street identified populations. There is literature looking at housing in Black communities. And I know we weren't able to get into this as in depth as we wanted to, but when we talk about a street identity, we're talking about people who oftentimes have had interface with the criminal justice system, and they are involved in some way in the streets, and it's a form of resilience or survival, right? And so when we look at the literature, what we found is that many folks who are street identified or low income oftentimes might sleep in cars or local parks or stay with friends or relatives, what the literature refers to as couch surfing. Oftentimes the homes they live in are overcrowded, which means they maybe have 2-3 families living in a household meant for one. There's insect and rodent infestations, lack of adequate furniture. As I said, when you spend more than 30% of your income on your housing, you have less money for electric, water bills. We see a lot of people who face eviction because they don't have the money, right, to keep themselves housed. And what some of the literature that we were able to find says is that poor housing leads some young people to actually join gangs or hit the streets, right, because it's a way to help out their families to make some kind of income. The article that's here, I actually screenshot this from a article that was in Delaware Online, so that's a local newspaper. What they found and what we want to talk about today is this connection between violence and housing status, right? So this this was over the summer, I want to say. There was a guy who shot, I think it was like his girlfriend, and then he ended up killing himself. But this same apartment building is the Delaware Online did a story saying that when they went to that apartment building, what they saw was mold and rodents, right? So again, we're seeing this intersection of violence and poor housing conditions. And what does that mean, again, for people's well-being? Next slide, please. So were you going to do this one? Or am I doing this one? Okay. I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen soon. So basically, we were looking at housing type, so how people describe their living conditions. So when Dr. Payne talked earlier about that 45-page instrument, there was a section that specifically focused on housing and well-being. And those are the two subscales that we examined for this research. We looked at how many people lived with them, right? So again, thinking about that concept of overcrowding. Who are the people that you live with? Are they family? Are they friends? Are they just acquaintances, right? Folks that you might just be staying with because you have no other place to stay. What is the condition of your neighborhood home, right? Is it safe? Does it have running water? Things of that nature. How safe is it, right? Are there break-ins in your neighborhood? And then the psychological well-being had 15 standardized items that looked at intrapersonal, affective, or emotional states, right? So we're looking at subjective well-being. So what we talked about in the earlier panel, it isn't our assessment of whether or not someone feels good about themselves. It's their own, right, expression of how they feel. And I really want to highlight that because many times when we look at well-being in the literature, it's the assessment from someone else. It's not the actual person's expressing how they feel. And because, again, we think about this, many folks are trained on white normative standards, right? The way that they are assessing a situation may look very different from the person who's actually experiencing it. So we wanted to make sure we got their perspective. So I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen for research questions.
Sure. So for this research, we had 3 research questions. The first one is, how do street identified Black men and women group into classes based on their housing status? So based on those questions that we talked about right before this with Anne. And then what demographic characteristics actually predict that class membership? And then third, next slide, please. Sorry. Thanks, Yas. And then third, do the various housing status classes differentially predict street identified men and women's psychological well-being?
Next slide, please.
And then this is just a slide, brief method slide, but since everyone was here before, you all know about the methods that we use, but really just wanted to highlight that we are using the quantitative surveys from 771 men and women in this sample.
And soon coming is an analysis of the qualitative.
Yes.
Takes a little bit longer though.
Yes.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, so our analysis can really be summarized into 3 different categories. And I would love to say, yeah, we just took these 3 steps, but realized that each one of these were a very methodological and iterative process. I mean, like weekly we were meeting for particularly step 2. But for step one, what we first performed was a confirmatory factor analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the second slide, but for now, I'll just say that a confirmatory factor analysis allowed us to get a continuous measure of psychological well-being, which was the outcome of our model. The second step was a latent class analysis. Now, LCA is a lot similar to a confirmatory factor analysis in that you are able to summarize the data, but it's categorical instead of a continuous value like that first approach. The third step was essentially combining our first and second step, where we took the latent categories and then figured out how they predicted, or at the very least had a relationship with our outcome, which was psychological well-being. Next slide, please. So for our first step, that's CFA, the confirmatory factor analysis, here we're showing a graph of what that looks like, where each X is representing one of the indicators or the survey questions that was asked to the different participants. These survey questions were based on the Franklin Psychological Wellbeing Index, and essentially the summarization of all of those different questions created that psychological well-being continuous score that we use as our outcome. Next slide. Yeah. So the second step is a latent class analysis, and that latent class analysis also used questions from our survey, but specifically questions that were related to housing status. Previously, Anne talked about things like housing type and the different types of people who were living in a particular household, and those are the different questions that were used. And it's the next slide. Those are the particular questions that we used to categorize people into different housing status. And then after, and then after we got those different categories of people who were experiencing different types of living, we wanted to see what the relationship was between the different types of living and psychological well-being, which is shown by that beta coefficient, which is essentially that relationship between psychological well-being and housing status, the circle and the square there. Next slide.
Okay. So then we also wanted to talk about how we're also using principles of quant crit, or quantitative critical race theory. And here's the 5 principles that I'll briefly go over. So the first is the centrality of racism, and talking about how racism is complex and deeply rooted in our society. And quantifying racism is not easily done, or there's no real obvious way to actually quantify that, which is something that we had to think about in our analysis. Another principle is that numbers are not neutral, right? And we should be interrogated for their role in promoting deficit analyses, and especially deficit analyses that serve the interests of whites and white elites in particular. Also, that categories are not natural, and units and types of analysis must be critically evaluated. And in particular, the ways that we will create race categories in our research, or the way we control for race in our analysis, but what kind of harm is that actually doing, and thinking through that. And then also voice and insight are vital, right? So these critical analyses should be informed by the experiential knowledge of the populations that we are working with. And finally is a social justice and equity orientation, and just rejecting this false notion that statistical research is politically neutral and value-free, as we know that it is not. And so we had to think very critically about the variables and questions we were using in our analysis and how we were interpreting those results as well. And so now I'm going to continue and talk more about what we actually found in this analysis. Thanks. So next slide is, this is the percent of the sample that we found that belonged to the 3 different latent classes, which is what we found fit our model best. So our first class had about 48% of our sample in it. Then the class number 2 in the orange had 37%. And then class number 3 is in the blue, and that had 15% of the sample. The next, thank you. Next slide. The next is our housing type question that we talked about. So like, where are people living? when they describe their housing. So on the y-axis, we have the probability of the response. And so group membership is probabilistic, right? So it's a probability. So we can see that from class 1 that they most likely lived in low-income housing. We can see that class 2 also most likely lived in low-income housing, while class number 3 was most likely to live in mid-income housing or condominiums or a private home. Next slide, please. So then household size. So who do you live with? And it's important to note for this question that we had participants include themselves. So for one person, that would be they're living alone. So just to keep that in mind in the interpretation. So for class 1, they were most likely to live with 2 or 3 people or 4 or 5 people. And that also includes themselves. Class 2, they're most likely to live with 4 or 5 people. And then finally, class 3 was most likely to either live alone or with 1 or 2 other people. And then for household composition, this is the question of who do you live with? So class 1 was most likely to live with other family. So this would be grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters. Class number 2 was most likely to live with acquaintances, and these were non-familial persons, or they were maybe a roommate, something like that. And then class 3 was most likely to live with their partner or live by themselves. The next question we have is, were the homes and buildings in your neighborhood well maintained? And across the board, we saw all 3 classes primarily were disagreeing with that. And then home safety, most of the classes as well had a high probability of never being broken into for their home. So then what we have here is now that we learned more about the classes and kind of their makeup, then we looked at the housing status of all those questions by covariate to see if we could figure out if, age, gender, marital status predicted membership into any of those classes. And so we found overall that younger people were more likely to be in class 2 and older people, therefore, in class 1. And we also found that females were more likely to be in class 1 and males more likely to be in class 2. And so those were 2 of our statistically significant results that we found. And then we found that marital status actually did not predict membership into any of those classes. Next slide. Thank you. And then the final step of the analysis was to see if the means of psychological well-being were different across any of the classes. And we found, you'll see in the far right where we have the green, that there was a difference in late in class 1 and late in class 3 in those means. And so while there was a difference, and we are saying that the late in class number 1 had a lower mean, we're not saying that they had low psychological well-being, but we are saying it was lower when compared to the other groups, which when you have 3 groups, you're most likely to have, someone higher and lower unless they're all the same. So just to point that out as well.
It's you. That's me. Okay. All right. So as Kathleen identified, and as well as Zach in terms of the process, and as we talked about in our earlier session, what do we do with this data, right? And so yes, we're going to publish it, hopefully, right, that's going to happen. But most importantly, it's like, how do we help address issues of like policy and practice? And so one of the findings, or I should say one of the policy implication, is we need to have more housing access and affordability specifically for street identified populations. What we found is that many of the women, right, lived in housing that was not as good, right? And as Kathleen said, it wasn't that it was low, but it was not as great. We want to make sure when it comes to issues of well-being that there are comprehensive support services for the men and the women, right? And I really want to highlight here, and I know I'm jumping here to the gender considerations, is that oftentimes when we think about housing, we think about women. And I'm not saying that we should not think about women, but there are a lot of men, right, who have come out of prison, who also are fathers, right, who also are brothers, who also want to help their families. And oftentimes they are excluded from housing. And if we want to, right, thinking about this from a family science perspective, if we are trying to restore, in particular, Black families, we need to provide more support and resources and access for housing to men. We also want to focus more on what's called a housing first approach. So in the literature, what that means is if a person is dealing with mental health issues or substance use issues, many times housing programs deny them access until they can get that part of their life together. What the data shows is that if you don't have safe, stable housing, it's much harder to take your medication, right? It's much harder to feel that sense of well-being. So house them. Once you've housed them, then we can start to address those other issues. But if we don't house them first, we're just going to keep seeing them cycling in and out. Which down to bullet, what is that? 5, reducing recidivism. Right? If we are serious about keeping folks out of prison, right? And I won't even talk about the whole prison industrial complex and how many are owned by private institutions, a very lucrative business. But if we're serious about reducing recidivism, then we need to make housing available to those who have past incarceration records. So in the state of Delaware, there is a housing pilot program which unfortunately is not doing the best job of getting recommendations and supporting folks as they come out of prison. And so we really want to use this data to think about how do we push on policy? How do we have better programs for folks coming home so they don't end up back in prison? And so one example, and I'll be very honest, it was hard to find good models of housing for folks who have past incarceration. And I am biased because I'm originally from Chicago. So of course I was like, yeah, Illinois, we have this bill that just got passed maybe about a few months back, and it limits PHAs, our public housing authorities, from refusing housing to people with criminal histories. So many times the affordable homes are those that are public housing, but they often have very strict requirements, right, on who can stay there. And it doesn't only put the person who's come home from prison at risk of not being stably housed, but many times these rules are very punitive. So if you house someone, right, if you're a grandmother, a mother, a cousin, a daughter who says, yes, I'm going to take, right, my relative in, you can lose your housing because you have someone who has a past criminal record. Right. And so now that, again, destabilizes the entire family. And so we're really trying to think about, again, policies that make sense and that keep people housed. Next slide, please. So I know I highlighted some of this in the previous talk, but I really just want to, again, reiterate that this work, even though it's theoretical, right, it's very quantitative, and what oftentimes I can tell you all, for me, I'm a qualitative researcher, which is why I'm so glad that I have a graduate student that loves to do regressions and things like that. It's amazing and wonderful. And Dr. Collier, who is also like an expert on all things quant, and that they help me to better understand, right, these numbers and how to translate them into like action and activism. So some of the work that we've been doing, right, again, is to recruit folks who are impacted by the carceral system so that they also have a better understanding of their rights. And what we talk about in these workshops that we just started doing is these are your current rights, but there's other places that have actually more rights, and how do we get those rights here? Right. And so thinking about a future self, right? What can we be? Right. And I think, again, connecting it to our theme is we know what it is. We know what is, but it doesn't mean that that's what it has to be. And so how do we use this data to push policy to get to like these aspirations that we have around housing stability, specifically for street identified folks? Next slide, please. That is the end of our presentation. This is our contact information. I just want to highlight that we had another graduate student, Lulu, who worked really hard with us. She is also on the paper, and so she isn't able to be here with us today, but I just wanted to make sure we also brought her into the space. And of course, Dr. Payne, I know that you're chilling right now, but if it was not for Dr. Payne and really helping us make sense of, right, some of the data, and as Zach said, we met weekly to make sure that we were getting it right. Thank you all. Hand it over. So Jess, the next PowerPoint, please. Okay, great.
Can I tell jokes or just fill in the time? Is that I'll give a little bit of context before the presentation. to introduce myself as well as where this project came from. So as I said before, I'm just a physician. I'm not really experienced in sociology and psychology and a lot of the other measures and metrics that are well represented here. But what I did do was I lived for a couple years on the north side of the city of Wilmington, as was introduced. It's one of the, it's the largest city in the state of Delaware. And the neighborhood was one that was heavily affected by firearm violence specifically. And I lived there for several years during my training as a resident, and have been here in the state of Delaware since. And on several occasions, twice, there were gunshots outside the house where I was holding pressure on the wounds. Would hear gunshots on a regular basis, knew people, talked with people who were either directly affected or indirectly affected, as if there's that much of a difference. We'll talk about that in a moment. And just realizing that the view and the perspective from outside the community is one in which people expect those who live there to adjust and to acclimate and to treat it as normal. And yet in every instance of people that I spoke with, my neighbors, my friends, and what I experienced myself was that it's never normal. And the fact that that was a stunning realization to myself, who grew up in my childhood in the suburbs, was one illuminating point as to the discrepancy and the disparity, the inequity, really, that's baked into our systems and the way in which people perceive neighborhoods and the way that life in the neighborhoods really can be like. There were a variety of other contexts there, and I really deeply appreciate the work that you're doing on housing. From the clinical perspective, my job is as a hospitalist. I see patients who are in the hospitalized setting and frequently who themselves have had remote issues as being a victim, either directly or indirectly, of violence, and some who have permanent disability and who have difficulty then with housing and appropriate housing for them, or those who have difficulty being in close quarters with other people for a variety of reasons, or even those who have been very recently or acutely injured, wanting to find a place that's safe, given that they're afraid that someone may know where they were living previously and may try to injure them again. And so the housing issues are exacerbated for specific subsegments in ways that are often difficult to understand, again, to people who are coming from outside the neighborhood, as myself had been and am currently. But we'll get a little bit more into it, and just wanted to provide some context for myself in terms of why this seems so crucial, and it is so crucial and pressing. And so what we're talking about is a community-engaged latent class analysis, and these fancier titles and explanations there. Next slide. And before we start, I just want to say, with gratitude and remembrance, these are the many people that have been involved with this project. And in particular, I would like to dedicate this talk, parts of it, to Kenyatta Brooks, who was with us in the early stages of it, and sadly passed away. And this project has been supported in part by a grant from the Institutional Development Award. Next slide. So just to give some context, I pulled this data directly from the News Journal, our state newspaper. And these are shooting incidents by month spanning nearly a decade in the city of Wilmington. Each kind of tick on there is an incident for which there may be more than one victim of the shooting. In red are the homicides, and blue are the non-homicide but injured. And you can see there's seasonality to it, but year on year, there hasn't been a year where it's zero. And this provides context for the year in which the survey was conducted, that the information is gathered from, as well as creeping into 2020. It's just towards the beginning, I think, of 2020 there when I last pulled this data. But 2020 and 2021 are near record highs in terms of shooting incidents within the city of Wilmington as well. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about community violence exposures, it's one term. There are a number of them that are out there describing this phenomenon, if you will. In some of the literature, these are described as creating general strain on people. That, and the way that it's conceived of is, if you hear a shooting, if you see a shooting, if you're experiencing it, It creates different levels of strain, but it's just kind of in this bucket of general strain that's applied as a pressure to you in your life. But more recent, and I think more appropriate ways of thinking about community violence exposure says, no, this is really something that's multidimensional and heterogeneous, meaning that it's not the same, right? You being shot versus you watching someone being shot versus you hearing about someone being shot, as compared to a stabbing, as compared to a blunt assault injury, as compared to a relative, as compared to something that happened 1 year ago, as compared to 1 month ago. I think the young people call it these days, it hits different, right? It hits different, right? And so it's one thing for me to hear weekly shootings, right, on the block. It's another thing to be holding pressure to someone directly. It's another thing to be talking with someone I know and is a friend that's been affected, that just lost their brother, right? As compared to somebody who's from outside the city that has no direct knowledge or influence for people in the community. Mm-hmm. And so how do we then approach something where there's so many possible different dimensions to something that's that complex? And let me pose it to you another way. Think about COVID. Doesn't it hit different if it's someone that you know that got it versus you yourself that got it, versus hearing about someone or reading about it in the paper or seeing it in a different kind of context? It hits different. Mm-hmm. So too with violence. And yet we don't tend to give it that same kind of credibility. We just lump it all together. And so how do we begin to tease that apart and recognize the complex phenomenon for what it is and how it hits different people differently? What does it mean for a mom that's afraid for her children as compared to someone that's a younger male adult who's trying to make it as well, right? So can we see some of these differences and correlate these then to people's health and health outcomes? And the inspiration for this project came when I was in the neighborhood and talking with a neighbor across the street, and we were catching up a bit, and she told me, she said, yeah, I'm going to the doctor, I'm getting results from my scan next week, and I'm really worried about it because it might be cancer. Oh, and somebody came by and shot out the windows above me, and I look up and sure enough, there are bullet holes lining the windows. And it just struck me that both of those incidents that in my mind, right, I would count as disparate, unrelated things, were related to her in terms of her well-being, in terms of her health, right? And she herself was not a direct victim in the way most people think about shootings, but was exposed to community violence. And in her mind, that was part of the same thing, and not as a quote-unquote typical victim of violence, and yet has and carries the weight and the burden of that. Next slide, please. And so this is just a quick review of the survey, as has been extensively described so far, so I won't spend too much more time on it. But some of the subsections that were included in the survey were asking you about direct health measures, perception, self-rated health, quality of life, as well as certain health conditions. Next slide, please. And so as we describe it as researchers, as people in the academy, so to speak, in terms of latent class analysis, this may be how it's described in different ways. So latent class analysis tends to look at a categorically described latent variable, something that itself is not directly measurable, that you can only indirectly measure through other indicators, as we call them. There's all different sort of names and terminologies for these aspects, but that's the concept behind categorical, latent variable, and latent class analyses. And so the indicators themselves can be a mixture of categorical or continuous measures, as I think talked about before. It's important to distinguish between these, but a lot of what we were looking at were categorically defined, because how do you measure violence, right? A lot of times it's in these categorical ways. And so next slide. One of the things that Dr. Payne had said years ago that really stuck with me is how sometimes we engage in research colonialism. Right? When we do the research, we harvest the data, we harvest the results, and then the people that are doing the harvesting get rewarded with it, but then those who are living it and who provided that data to begin with don't gain the benefit or even the knowledge of what was found. And so again, putting these pieces together and saying, how can we design a study and a research that also brings that information from what had been gathered back to the community and tries to validate those assumptions with the community itself, right? And so when we talk about latent class analyses and these different sort of classes or groupings, a lot of times it's the researchers that are assigning the labels to the classes or making decisions in terms of which variables to include or not. And these can be very technical, complex decisions. As, again, the rest of the panelists here are far more expert than I in it. One of the thoughts was, well, can we teach people from the community at least the rudiments of what latent class analysis is? Because it actually is a kind of intuitive way of understanding data, right? And so what I did, and when we were getting together with the participatory action researchers and brewing this study, is there was a jar with a bunch of implements on the table. I took this picture this morning from my kitchen table, so this is a simulation, right? But what I did was we were sitting there and I took the cup holder and put it on the table, and I said, okay, there are all these objects here, right? And let's say you just had one bucket to put them in. How would you do that? You just scoop them all and put them in the bucket. So what if I gave you 2 buckets to kind of sort all the stuff in? How would you do it? And so say, well, how would you do it here? Right? And so you see different things that are here on the table. You might say, oh, there are pencils and there are not pencils, right? Or there's erasers and there's not erasers, right? But you kind of have to make a decision in terms of how you do it. And how do you do it? You're actually looking at different features, different indicators of each object. It can be long and thin, such as a pencil. It can be shorter and fatter, or it can be a different color, a different purpose, like a pencil as compared to a dry erase marker, which is in there. So there are ways in which we can say, okay, take each object, describe them in different ways using different indicators, right? And then we try different buckets, different numbers of buckets. Let's try 2 buckets, and let's try 3 buckets. And at some point, you kind of run out of buckets where it's useful, right? One bucket may only have one thing in it, but sometimes you really need that one thing, right? And you need to have it already separated from the others and being able to identify it. But each object can only go in one bucket at a time. And that's what latent class analysis kind of is, if I understand that correctly, right? It's saying, how do we sort each individual object based on these observed indicators into different buckets in a way that makes sense? That's a natural grouping for each of these things that has meaning to it. And what is the meaning? What's the internal method in which you are sorting it? With latent class analysis, the computer is doing it in a statistical way, and it says, well, here are the buckets. The computer thinks 4 buckets probably work well for sorting it, and it then sorts all the objects into these 4 buckets, and now it's up to you to come up with the label to put on each bucket. That's latent class analysis. So we have, next slide, one approach to the many variables that were collected in this study is to say, okay, what are different indicators related to violence and violence exposure, as well as other covariates or outcomes that are important to the way in which someone's health is sensitive to violence exposures? Does that make sense? Right? And so there are different indicators. So someone may be directly victimized either by, and I just picked a subset here. These are variables I picked off the top of my head as saying, in a given model, if we just kind of were trying to come up with an early model, how would we do this? And so serious injury, stabbing, shooting, and differentiation based on whether you yourself were directly victimized or whether you observed it or whether you just, quote unquote, just heard about it, as well as other questions that have been included, such as, I could see myself committing a violent crime in 5 years, or do I think that carrying a gun or a knife would help me feel safer? Do these things indicate, right, are they an observable and a significant feature in terms of determining someone's sensitivity? So as an example, why would crazy Dr. Chen think that including the question, if I could see myself committing a violent crime in 5 years, be included in here? Well, and maybe if you don't feel that there is, well, if you feel that that's a possibility, you've already perhaps thought about the cost and the risk to your own health, and perhaps you're less sensitive to how you might answer the question, how is your health today? Right? You may say, oh, today I feel great, but hidden under that is, I'm not sure compared to where I might end up being 5 years from now. I don't know, right? And so again, these other questions, I'm afraid of getting hurt by violence. How much does that affect one's health in the many ways that we can try to define health? And that kind of goes to the right side in terms of outcomes of covariates, right? In general, would you say your health is, and then we kind of recode it into excellent or poor, good or bad. And this, historically in health research, is a pretty good proxy, actually, for a person's actual physical health according to other measures, right? And so if you were going to ask a question, this is kind of a basic question that's often used, as well as future-oriented thinking, right? I expect my health, right, to get worse. Do you have any chronic health issues? Because you would think that would have the most impact when someone thinks about their health. And is this affected, again, by this violence exposure? Next slide. So we kind of threw these indicators into the model, cranked it out. Covariates and distal outcomes were all included together as, as covariates for the technical experts here on the table. And then so we're looking at the different class fits. And this is not the best model, right? This is just a model as a demonstration to the group here in terms of how we were trying to think through this and approach this. So said, okay, between a 3 and a 4 class model might work. 3 or 4 buckets for sorting people's responses to these questions in this survey, right? So next slide. So then the next question becomes, okay, for the next slide, what was, if there was just one bucket, right? You took everybody that answered all these questions together, and what did they say to those questions, to those covariates, to those outcomes that we're looking at? And so the next slide will kind of show what the overall response was, right? And so I tried to help make this a bit more intuitively visual, right? And so we use a software called Latent Gold, which does really good in making kind of visual, quick preparations of this. And so you can see on the left side, it's the more of the classic indicators, right? Were you a direct victim of a person with the arm in the sling, of a serious injury as compared to a stabbing, as compared to a shooting? Did you only see it? Did you only hear of it? Some of those other questions. And you can see the sample size of those that answered all of the questions, including the covariates that were included. So to just kind of point out as an example, most people said, no, I would not see myself committing a violent crime in the next 5 years, right? Which I think makes sense. So that may not be as useful of a question to include in the model. And that's why looking at the base descriptions is important. So then we said, okay, we did this with 4 classes. So we had the participatory action researchers and showed them these slides and said, here's class 1. What label would you give to class 1? So class 1 is kind of highlighted there with the red circles, right? And the red circles there say, those are the responses for class 1 as compared to the group as a whole, right? And so you can see here, class 1 was less likely to have been a direct victim from any of those 3 indicators than the group at large. They were more likely to have seen or perhaps have heard of it, and they were less likely to say that they were afraid of being hurt by violence than the group at large, right? And then so the group of participatory action researchers that have been part of this project, they said, we would call this witnesses who are men. Because if you look here, 224, so about 40% of the entire group that was looked at were men in this mix. Next slide. So for this one, this is class 2, right? And so we asked the group, how would you label, how would you describe this class? So we see here, much more likely, almost all of them had described having been a victim and being essentially seriously injured by violence, right? And to also have almost universally in this group seen or heard of it as well, right? This is really tricky with latent class analysis because now there's a question of whether we're violating local independence assumptions, and I may ask for your help in figuring out some of that later. But again, this is kind of an exploratory method of saying, let's throw those variables in there, see how these classes generally pan out, and we can refine some of these later, right? And then we see they're more likely to say that carrying a weapon made them feel safer than the group at large. Right. Next slide. So the third class, I believe, oh great, now I have to try to see if I can pull this off of memory. There we go. We're less likely to be directly victimized than the group. We're perhaps more likely to have seen it, right? And we're had a greater makeup of women here. And sorry, I had misquoted the percentages. This entire class was entirely made up of women. I think the prior class was mostly made up of men that were witnesses, hence the title, Witnesses Who Are Men, Witnesses Who Are Women, right? And then next slide for the fourth and the final class, if you could guess, oh, there it is, right? So this group here was unlikely to have ever been victimized directly, right? Less likely to have heard or seen it than the total group. And we kind of, your gut sense maybe, yeah, probably less likely to have heard or seen it than the two other classes, witnesses that were men or women. And so it was interesting that the participatory action researchers came up with these names, right? To say this one they called bystanders. Now, how is bystander different from witnesses, right, who are men or women? Well, the thought there was many of them had heard of shootings or had heard of violence in general, if aggregated. And so the thought was that they may not be likely to say that they had directly seen or been more out of the area or the neighborhood, but were not without involvement or without proximity to it, if that makes sense, right? So it's not completely ignorant, as it say, if you were to come up with a different name for it, but just bystanders. So we kept that name, bystanders. Next slide. And then so we said, okay, with these different classes, how do these then relate to those covariates and or distal outcomes, right? And so you can see chronic or serious health issues, group 2 and 3 had the highest description of having had a chronic or serious health issue. That's victims and witnesses who are women. So you see among the groups of witnesses, women were at least more likely to say that they had a health condition. Perhaps maybe even at the same frequency as people who were directly victimized by violence, right? Well, what about the people who were directly victimized by violence? Would you think that they would say, yeah, I have a chronic health condition? Well, it depends on how serious the injury was. And then so we looked at their responses to these different questions, right? There wasn't that much of a difference actually by age, which was surprising because as one gets older, one acquires more chronic health issues and conditions, or at least the awareness of them, like hypertension, diabetes, things like that. So what do we infer about this? Next slide. And so we actually are, because of latent class analysis, able to do actual statistical comparison between the groups and say what looks significant versus what doesn't look significant. So we can say that when we talk about chronic or serious health issues, there was a difference between these classes in terms of how that was described and the frequency of which it was described. Yet, across the different groups, they all pretty much said their health was about the same to one another, right? So it's interesting that there's a difference in what the chronic health conditions are that are experienced by topology of violence exposure. Yet when you ask them the question, how is your health doing? They're likely to give you an answer that's similar to their peers, right? Or to others in this group. If we look at emotional or physical interference with activities in the past 4 weeks, so recency measure, there was a difference between those that described as victims as compared to those as bystanders, right? So again, there is an impact that's there. Now, whether that's related to another chronic underlying health condition may be possible, isn't clear. But then again, you come back to this question, well, do you expect your health to get worse? They say, oh, give very similar responses. So the way that people conceive of their health versus what their actual exposure to violence and chronic health conditions are is different. Next slide. These are just raw percentages, so I would say don't read too much into it, but actually looking at some of these health conditions, asthma, depression, arthritis, and other sort of arthritic conditions, hypertension, you see high prevalence of, say, hypertension among those that are victims, right, and those that are witnesses who are women. So why is that if most of the victims are men, and why is there such a difference between them and, say, those that are witnesses who are men, right, in terms of these classes, if their ages are otherwise similar, right? And so again, there's a relationship here, but I am not yet smart enough to figure out exactly what that is, or perhaps we need to ask better questions. But the challenge that's forthcoming, and next slide, and actually if you want to skip ahead a couple, because I'm sorry, we're short on time. Next one after that. Where are we going from here? And so the next part of this, phase 2, as it were, is to then gather focus groups to present it in kind of the same way I just did with you, right? Doing that demonstration and saying, what is latent classes? How do we understand that? Here are these results. help us make sense of it, right? Why do you think there's a difference here in terms of the health that people experience or describe, and why they're more likely to not have it, well, I should say, why they may not report their health as poor or poorer, even if they have, on paper, the same tendency to say, oh yeah, I have a health condition, but I view my health as good, right? Is it because they feel it's controlled? Is it feel it's well taken care of? Is it because they're trying not to think about it too much? What are the reasons behind that? And then use that as the launch point for further investigation, as well as being able to feed back what we had already found to the community. And so the people who are participating in those focus groups gains insight as well to how people feel. And would certainly like to ask, what are your thoughts about how things have been in 2020 and 2021, right? With health, with violence, both of these things being heavily affected in community. And I think that's pretty much all I got. Next slide, I think it's just references and a summary of that. That's it. Oh, yeah, some supplemental data looking at some of the questions and breakdown there.
So I think we're gonna get ready to open up for Q&A. But again, the purpose of this panel was to highlight, so we have a bunch of working groups, and we encourage all grad students and faculty. We have so much data that if you need some data and or you wanna be a part of one of the working groups, just let us know, and we'll figure it out together. But the purpose of this panel, again, one of the underlying themes is LCA, right? So keep in mind, I go against the grain a little bit in the PAR literature. I think a lot of the PAR literature, we go against the grain, but I think a lot of the PAR literature is very, very theoretical. And I think there's a role for theory, and we're about theory. But I would, if there's anything, and I'm all PAR, we're all PAR, but if there's one aspect that I'm critical of is that there much more rigorous scholarship by the PAR researchers. Can no longer use the excuse, right, that activism over analysis or something like that. It's both and publish in the journals and train local residents with real skill sets. Yes, we privilege and we underscore sometimes, in the PAR literature, indigenous knowledge, right? But it's not indigenous knowledge over or with the exception of traditional analysis. We want to equip them with this kind of skill set so that they can fight, right? And not training them in ways that doctoral students are being trained is actually undermining these communities, right? I also would argue that the reason that is also happening, PAR researchers, a lot of us lack strong methodological and empirical and particularly quantitative skill sets. And I'm only saying to say this, that's okay, right? Wherever you are at, that's actually okay. When you're doing this kind of work, there's a lot of dimensions to the research program, and no one person can do it all, right? So therefore, it allows us now to reach out to Christiana Care. Hey, can you help us out with LCA analysis? I don't have that expertise. Dr. Aviles doesn't have that expertise, so we are able to get Dr. Chen and Dr. Collier and others in here, to help grow and expand the program, right? The other thing I wanted to say is this: in addition to the kind of LCA modeling that both of them have done, Dr. Chen also is part of this larger project. It begins with survey analysis around the violence and LCA and all of that, but he actually also had us, right? So he had the 5 PAR members that are part of this grant. He had Dr. Hitchens, also myself, and Mr. Chambers, who's also part of this project, also come up with our own LCA models while he supervised and oversaw it and asked us to plug in certain variables. And he really trained us in this stuff, so we took that aspect of training people from the neighborhoods. He took that seriously, right? This wasn't like decoration or something we can say. No, in addition to him really crunching out these numbers, folk from the streets who have real experiences in the streets also were taught about LCA. To me, that's what's magical about this stuff. And that's how we actually change communities. Because with those skill sets, the PAR members can now put that on their CVs or resumes and or leverage it for employment and educational opportunities. So cool, great gravy. Let's open it up for Q&A. So with regard to these 2 LCA presentations.
How popular is it? How useful is it? And then as it relates to the findings of the data.
I had a little summary slide that kind of broke it down in terms of like LCAs compared to like factor analysis, if that's helpful for that. So I don't know if it's possible to pull up one of those prior slides. It was like maybe the third one or fourth or so. But the first question is, actually, you know what? Dr. Collar's the expert here, so I'm gonna throw that thing.
That was surely looking like, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah. So first you have mixture modeling, which is its own thing, like type of cluster analysis removed from structural equation modeling. It really came out of computer science at first, and then you have structural equation modeling that's made it more of like this latent construct, which is the way that we are all using it. So it's mainly taught in the social sciences within structural equation modeling courses. It's a type of structural equation model, but if you go to computer science, they would not even be thinking about structural equation modeling, but still would be thinking about mixture modeling. So it's interesting depending on what discipline you're in, where it falls, but for us, it's a structural equation model.
And then what would you say the major criticisms are? So for
Ooh, yeah.
whole
Yeah. Oh man, I have a story, but I won't share the story. So share the story. Okay. Yeah. So when I was an intern at the Education Testing Service, like it was right in the middle of my graduate school and career. I was so excited. I'm like, oh, I'll do this mixture model. And my boss, who I just really wanted to go there and work with, he was like, I don't believe in those models. And I was like, oh man, that's what I'm, focused on. That's what, my master's thesis was on. That's what my dissertation is going to be on, So that was like a buzzkill for sure. But yeah, so the reason why he didn't like it was because of the kind of like that intuitive nature where it's like, okay, the computer will give you these classes, but it's up to me as like this all-knowing expert to identify what the classes are. And another messy thing that's a little bit more methodological is the fact that we really don't. And I have a paper that it should be coming out. It's in print. But yeah. I have this paper that's really just talking about the different ways in which we can figure out the number of clusters, because right now there's really no one set way of determining how many classes you have. I remember you posting entropy in one of your slides, which is one of the fit measures for testing the distance between the classes. And if you think just numerically, the larger the separation is between those classes, which is the larger the entropy, the better you can identify that this is an actual class and not just multiple classes fitting in one kind of distribution. But anyway, the point is that with fit, there is no one fit measure. Entropy is just one measure, but you have AIC, you have BIC. There's a number of different techniques that have been used to figure out how to do that. And in this paper, I proposed a way to go about doing it. It's a simulation study, so it worked for that particular simulation, but it may not necessarily work in all cases. So that's the limitation of any Monte Carlo simulated paper. But yeah, I would say those are the two major criticisms. One, that we can't fit it, and there isn't really one way to fit it, and different people use different fit. So it's kind of like whatever works for you or what were you trained in, and then also just categorizing it and knowing what, some people will just categorize it based on literature. Other people will categorize it based on like what they know, having had talk with the people that they're studying. Those are the holes, and any statistical method is going to have holes.
And I'll say one thing that I definitely struggled with, I guess I got muted, is overfitting, right? And so it's really easy to just be like, oh yeah, here is the model based on a really small sample size, like 200 people, 300 people. And so I think some of the advantage here is that this is a pretty respectable sample size for these variables. And I think the argument is, people may criticize the use of the model, but I would say for categorical conceptions, right? Not everything is continuous. And I feel like a lot of models fall because they make an assumption of something as continuous when it's really not. And so that's why I really first got attracted to LCA and really appreciate the work here on it.
And then I was also going to add one more thing in terms of a methods perspective. I've also seen LCAs being used a lot more now in mixed methods research, and especially being used to kind of create those groups like, we were talking about, or Dr. Chen was talking about, and then to actually be able to follow up with participants who might fall into those different classes and to learn more about their experiences. So what he was talking about in terms of following up with focus groups, following up with interviews, and to really dig into those different classes and what's going on with the bystander group or the witnesses for men, women, right? Or with our classes as well. So that's another way I've seen it being used a lot recently in the literature.
Miss Mary Tess.
I have a couple questions, but it's not really to LCA, it's more about data collection. So I don't know a ton about like housing and violence and how that's being measured broadly, but first of all, are there, I guess in your opinion, is that information being collected in a way that's accurate to the people who are experiencing it currently in the US?
So it sounds like you're asking about sampling strategies or techniques, which is a great question. I will say this, interestingly enough. So, I created Street Par, right? And in creating it, particularly with my dissertation in New York and North New Jersey, a lot of my earlier work, even though at that time I was mostly examining, how Black men in the streets were experiencing opportunity, jobs in schools, and/or their attitudes with jobs in schools. That was like my question, kind of like a Jay McLeod ain't no making it, but that was his thesis in that famous street ethnography, right? Or Al Young's work, who also looks at opportunity in the streets. But I was collecting I collected over 400 surveys for that study and a ton of interviews. The way I thought about street par, most of par is done inside schools, right? Or is really with a captive audience, right? Schools, prisons, or a setting. My thing was we need to create something for the street corners themselves. And why aren't we going there, right? This is like a race matters. I know I'm going over the place a little bit, but this is race matters Cornel West argument, right? If you help the bottom group, which are Black Americans descended of the slave South, I might add, right? And within that group, it's the criminal justice population, right? Vis-a-vis Michelle Alexander and Derek Bell and everybody else. That's really the bottom, that's the floor, that group right there, right? And due to Black respectability politics and everything else, right, we leave that group alone. Like, oh my God, let's go deal with everybody else. But the irony is, and this is what West says in Race Matters, if we can help that group, every other group would benefit. So why don't we work with that group, right? And then therein lies a whole bunch of other politics. But that was the logic around Street Par. Now, all that to say this, right? So the question for me was, what methodology could I identify that would work to collect a large survey sample? That was really my standard. I knew I could do the interviews, right? I can get 50 guys or 100 guys. But how can I collect a large survey sample? Because at that time, I was all quant. No ethnography, I was like Wolf, and I was taking all the confirmatory factor analysis classes. If you see my record, like in terms of the classes I was taking, it was all stat classes, right? And I knew, right, with my arrogance, that I can collect thousands of surveys from the street corners. I didn't even know that was a big deal for the academy, neither, at that time. But I knew I could do it, though. And, and at that time I was working also research program and had a lot of money in the research program. And even though they weren't doing it on street corners, they were doing it in prisons or schools. I was giving resources and the supervision to do it on the street corners, right? So then you get into a question around sampling. How is the data representative, right? If you're going to collect large survey data, right? And for us, it's a socio-political project. I needed to collect 1,000 surveys of guys on the street corner who sold crack cocaine. A, because nobody else could do it. B, now we can establish arguments that actually can help them fight or bring clarity to their lived experience. It was all about, and again, Street Par also is extending out of Dr. Huey P. Newton's call to start training gang members, right, in research and getting them published. That was what the Black Panthers was saying. They didn't have the opportunity to materialize it, right? But we do. That was their call, right? But we wanted to do it in the street corners. Now, that particular study, I never got a question about sampling from the journals. Everything I sent out got published too. This is early 2000s or thereabout. If you could go out there and get over 400 surveys from guys who sell crack cocaine, or however you got it, we'll take it, particularly at that time, right? I think there's been, since then, the Academy is trying to figure out how to, I write about this actually in the handbook chapter that's coming out soon, just the politics of design and all of that, and particularly to slow down this kind of community effort, right? But won't get into that. But nonetheless, at that time, it wasn't a whole, because nobody could do it. Nobody still can't really do it, right? But then it wasn't even being brought up because it was so novel. If you got them, we need to look at them and yada, yada, yada. It was a truly convenient sample. But when I came to Wilmington, I actually had the resources, and I met now a network of people. And now I had the resources to think through the work more rigorously. And so all that to say this, the kind of sampling that we implement is quota sampling, right? We don't do random sampling, which would be, I guess, the way to go about it. 1 drug dealer, 2 drug dealer, 3 drug dealer, 4. From our perspective, that's unethical. Can't do that. So what we'll go in, for this particular study, there were 7 subgroups, right? So 4 women, or 4 age groups, right, between the ages of 16 to 54. Then there were 3 age groups between the men between 16 to 44. Right, Brooklyn did a dissertation, added another group. All right, and then we organized a quota sample, right, based on those groups in the North Side and West Side. So, right, our 7 groups, we had to collect them in ways that they were representative of the larger groups of Black women and men in the North Sides and West Sides between the ages of 16 and 54, right? So that's what we use quota sampling. With the new study that I'm doing with Coley and a bunch of folk, the national study, we're doing something called RDS, respondent driven sampling, which is a whole nother technique. Now, I will say this, I'll end on this point, right? What I've learned, right, because I've taken a bunch of psychometric classes, I was initially trained in survey design, interestingly enough, right, before coming over to ethnography and qualitative. There is no way to determine if a street identified Black American sample is generalizable, right? You'll have some other folk that disagree with that, right? And I've been in these interesting debates in the last 2 weeks about this too, with folk in New York and elsewhere. A quota sample is based on a larger Black community. Most Black folk, even in the hood, are not involved in the streets, right? Surprise, surprise. They're just poor. They just live in the projects, right? The census data, which the quota sampling is based off of, there's no way to go out there and figure out how many people actually sell crack or identify a street, right? And then that number is fleeting. And even with guys who are in the street, their definitions are highly relative in terms of what street is, when you street, when it's not, and all kinds of stuff like that, right? So, right. So then how do you know the number, right? Then you can say, well, this guy got arrested this amount of time. That make him active in the streets. Well, from the perspective of the street, that don't make him active. That make him means people in the street. He has low power. But most folk who are not arrested and older and away from the street corners are actually seen by the streets as being more active, right? So traditional linear analysis can't handle that kind of dynamism, right, in the actual data. They could just count 1, 2, 3, 4, which, I'm not saying that's a bad thing or a good thing. There's limitations in all analysis. But my point is, the quota samples are based off of census data, because we don't have anything else that gives us a sense of how many Black folk are in a particular neighborhood. We're just doing it, to be honest with you, because we're trying to speak to rigor. But so what if we got, 7 quota samples and whatever is that? Does it really mean that what we have is representative of all the women between ages of 16 to 24 in the West Side? How would we even know that number? So, again, there are a lot of quantitative folk that would disagree and push back a little bit and say, hold on, and all of that. But to get into the weeds a little bit, that's actually the kinds of conversations that we have around sampling.
I'll just add to that, just in terms of the housing, more from the access piece. I think I shared this, that point in time count right now is the only count, and it's very flawed. right? And people know that, but they keep doing it. So
Straight up.
I don't know, that's the federal government, that's a whole other conversation. But what I will say about our instrument, originally, right, the focus of this data set was looking at the relationship between health, opportunity, and violence. Because my interests are around housing, I wanted to dig deeper, right, into what is the housing status, right, of the folks that we were surveying. But we had many conversations, I don't know if y'all remember, like trying to organize, like, okay, like, do we group the people that live in shelters, people that are in motels? Like, how do we organize this data? So I know we've talked about this, and this is like, I don't know, 5 years like down the road, is how do we develop an instrument that better or more precisely collects data around housing status. So right now we have kind of what Dr. Chen was saying, like these buckets based on, right, the LCA analysis or latent class analysis. But in hindsight, I think we would change some of those questions so that we could more precisely determine their actual housing status.
Also for the housing too, a lot of the guys who are active in the streets, right, don't experience housing, right? And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this, Ann, in the traditional sense, right? Because you talk about how they stay up and, you know, and so you can, so whatever the count is that they are arriving at in terms of who are homeless on a particular night, right? And she said this early in the presentation, but hopefully you can share a little bit more, is, right, the actual number of homeless people is not reflected. It's the way that they're counting too, right? And it's cultural. Meaning the way that we count, the way that we think about numbers or data, whether it's, you know, who's really active and strong in the streets, and you could think maybe it's the young guy on the street corner. Oh my God, he's not, trust me. Even though he's most likely to get shot and shoot, right? But he has very low power, you know, by the standards of the, but we don't know how to count that, or we don't really know how to count homelessness, not in the streets. So the person that's simply counted, right, is the mom with 4 kids and no man, right? And they make sure the man is not there, so because she can't get the opportunity, right? So, and then they get counted as the homeless people, right? But then there are another group of guys out there. I don't know if you want to, because you were describing it the other day so well in terms of how they stay up and,
I was
how they
just,
experience homelessness.
Yeah, I was giving the example that most folks in the streets, they're not going to go to shelter, right? And part of that is the pride around, right? Like, I'm not going to do that. And so they may engage in street activities actually as a form of coping because they don't have housing, right? And so if you're out in the street all night, thinking about that psychological well-being, I'm out in the street because I choose to be out in the street because I'm doing A, B, C, D, right? And so, or I'm going to hang out at the house, which might be a trap house, because I know they're up all night, right? And so I don't consider myself homeless, right? Because I'm engaged in these activities. And so that's like, how do we quantify that? How do we measure that? And that's where I think we need to do more, right? And again, I'm a qual person, is like to talk to the folks to say like, well, how would you describe your housing status? Right? Because the current measures don't fully capture the nuances that come with housing instability for this particular subpopulation.
And I'll just comment clinically, like how important that point is, because a lot of the resources we have within the healthcare sphere and how we kind of connect people to it with our social workers and things like that, people ask, oh, are you homeless?
Yeah.
It's like, most people say no.
Right.
No.
I'm staying with a friend, right? You know, because of exactly those resilience and that conception thing. And so I've noticed it. And so the lack of our ability to articulate those distinctions has a real world impact on service delivery, service connection, and then therefore the structural elements that we see then that perpetuate themselves out, right? And so I think, yeah, I just appreciate that point.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. All right, we are over time, folks, because it's 3:55. Thank you so much for your time. Derek Bell Legacy Award panel is up next at 4:15. Y'all are going to hear from some amazing folks. Right there are Derek Bell Legacy Award winners. We also have a new, only the second year that we're doing an Emerging Scholar Award. So these are more junior folks who are, right, the emerging critical race theory scholars in the field. So please stay, take a break. I'm sure there's coffee and stuff. So out there, we're also going to have a reception afterwards. There will be food. There will be a bar. So hang around and we'll see you all. Thank you so much for your time.